My friend, Shabbat Shalom. For those who've heard Dr. Rachel Fish already, whether it was last night or this morning, you know that Dr. Fish is she's on point, and she comes with not only her own research and studies, but also with a passion for combating anti-Semitism and hate. And she is on the front lines, and we are blessed to have her for this morning and this afternoon, and to have the opportunity to now turn our focus a little towards America's relationship with Israel. So we're not going to give a long introduction because we already know you. So Dr. Fish. And there will be time for a short Q&A afterwards because we have a 45-minute window.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you all for sticking around. You never know if people actually want to stick around. So thank you. And thank you for being deeply engaged in the conversation today. This conversation is about the North American Jewish communal relationship with Israel and the issues around anti-Semitism in the 21st century. And it feels like, to some degree, maybe we've already talked about that, and we have in some aspects, but we're actually going to dive deeper into understanding some of these various elements. And I actually want to start with some history in order to situate this conversation. When we think about America and what America represented in the New World, in many ways it was viewed as being the new Zion. Not just for Jews, for everyone. This place represented something unique and exceptional. It was not understood in the context, for example, of Europe, to be a nation state that was predicated upon a particular ethnicity, a particular religious group, a particular linguistic community. That's not how America was built. It was a mosaic from its early imaginings, and that is what it supposedly was supposed to be. The Jews of Europe who are thinking about where to go and what their options are during the age of immigration are really faced with two particular pressures. One is the pressure of anti-Semitism, which was very real. And one of the distinguishing factors of the anti-Semitism in the context of Europe was that it wasn't only bottom-up, it was top-down. It was government-sanctioned. It was Cossacks. It was the police units. It was decision-makers at the highest levels of society who created policies seeking to eliminate the presence of Jews in these communities. That's one of the major distinguishing differences, always, between America and the European experience. You often hear people say things like, what's happening today in America is reminiscent of 1930s in Germany. And I push back on that because what's happening in America may be deeply problematic, but it is not top-down in the same way. It doesn't mean that you don't have challenges politically, but you do not have the same scenario. Now, the other major pressure is acculturation and assimilation. Now, acculturation isn't a negative necessarily, but if it leads to assimilation, and assimilation here in this context means you shed your particularism in order to be fully accepted in the universal. Acculturation means you keep that particularism while having it help you orient the way in which you live in the universal. Everyone in this room is an acculturated Jew. Everyone sitting here. But assimilation was a real concern for Jews. Because what does it mean if you actually start to shed your Jewishness, whatever that entails, in order to be accepted? But then history tells us you aren't actually accepted. Theodor Herzl was one of the most assimilated Jews in Vienna. Everything you all know Jewishly, Herzl knew none of it. It's funny, we love Herzl. He's the father of modern political Zionism, but he couldn't tell you why you need to face towards the east to pray 3 times a day. And so you see someone like Herzl who says, I'm an Austro-Hungarian Jew. I'm a lawyer by training. I don't even engage Jewishly. I'm completely secular. And yet, the fraternity at the university won't accept me because I'm Jewish, even though I don't even practice Judaism. And yet, I can't get a job as a lawyer now. So now I have to get a job as a journalist, and oh my goodness, what happens? The Dreyfus Affair. And the Dreyfus Affair is very clear. High-ranking French army official, Dreyfus, is accused of dual loyalty because he's Jewish, and he is not engaged deeply at all with the Jewish community. So if you're an assimilated Jew in Europe, it doesn't guarantee you anything, actually, and it doesn't mean you're going to be free of the discrimination, the prejudice, and potentially the persecution, which for sure you will see by the 20th century. Now, when Woodrow Wilson is the president, he makes this incredible speech, the 14-point speech, where he's very clear that all peoples have the right to self-determination. Now, this is at a point in time in which you start to see the decline of empires. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, is dissolving. And you start to see that this idea of the emergence of nation states is an idea that is not just captivating for Jews, who also some desire political self-determination, but also for all the peoples who are trying to figure out what will the new world order look like and how will it be organized. Now, those Jews who decide that the answer for them will not be Zionism directly by moving and making Aliyah and going to this territory of Palestine, the land of Israel, which will be later the modern nation state of Israel, but rather they decide to come to America. And then this question arises around, if you identify deeply with Zionism, yet you did not choose to make Aliyah, move to this place, how do you hold a healthy relationship with American identity as well? And that's when we turn to a figure like Louis D. Brandeis. Louis D. Brandeis, and I encourage you to read his writings, really grapples with this idea of what it means to actually be a proud Zionist in the context of American history and the American society. And he, because of his exposure of living in Boston, he says Zionism and Americanism are 100% compatible. Just like being Irish and having loyalty to Ireland, just like being Italian and having loyalty to life in Italy, while deeply connecting to American life. And he actually writes this beautiful essay in which he says, you're a better American when you actually hold these multiple identities. They are not incompatible. They are deeply connected and rooted to one another. As Americans are trying to navigate their new reality, or Jews are trying to navigate their new reality in America, they also have to navigate what does it mean to actually feel this longing for land in Zion while staying here and not being perceived as not being loyal to American society, to democracy in this country. And so you really start to see, really by the 1940s and 50s, the American Jewish community specifically trying to navigate that tension and thinking about how they are going to organize themselves in order to be able to make the case on behalf of Israel or not. And there is a tension between what I would say are non-Zionists or a-Zionists and those who actually hold an anti-Zionist position. The American Jewish Committee, a well-known organization, when it is first emerging, is very influenced by German Jewish immigrants to this country. The majority of those German Jewish immigrants are a-Zionist or non-Zionist. It means that they're sort of parv on this place called Israel. It's not their top priority. And what's fascinating, and you can find these documents online, is that when David Ben-Gurion, who is then going to assume the role of the prime minister position for Israel, is basically traveling all around the world to diaspora communities and to international governments in order to make the case for the state of Israel. And when he's about to come to America, Jacob Blaustein, who is the head of the American Jewish Committee at the time, says, "We're really glad you're going to come, but there are some different rules you will have to play by when you are here." What are those different rules? He says, 1, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, you may not encourage Aliyah. I know you do that everywhere else you go to the Jewish community, but do not do it here. Remember, it's the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s. What are we concerned about in this country? Communism, McCarthyism. Deeply. We got to prove we're American. So that's a piece of this. The second thing he says, Blaustein says to Ben-Gurion, is you, Ben-Gurion, have to ensure that Israel and the future state of the Jewish people will be a democracy, a Western-oriented democracy. You will not be a communist state. This is very important in this equation. Now remember, for David Ben-Gurion, socialism is a key piece of Zionism at this point in time. You have a lot of Zionists who are deeply socialist, some deeply influenced by communism. And Israel is trying to figure out, how does it position itself between the East and the West? Who are the allies? Who does it need to become friends with? How can it get certain weapons for protection? Ensure that there is some international support? Remember, who in the United Nations first approves the establishment of the state of Israel? Russia. It's very interesting. Geopolitics at its best. It's not like the Russians were Zionists. So this is where you start to see there are multiple layers of what is happening politically. And so if you actually read the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion documents, what you will see is that Blaustein is trying to put to Ben-Gurion some parameters in a way that Ben-Gurion wouldn't have to speak at all in another diaspora community. But the American Jewish community is also navigating how is it American, how does it stay connected to Israel, and what does it look like to say you're Zionist when you actually don't live there? Now, the watershed moment for sure historically is the 1967 war. And the reason the 1967 war is a watershed moment is because for many American Jews, let alone, of course, Israelis who are there, 1967 feels like an existential threat. You've got Nasser of Egypt, who is a megalomaniac, who is not at all interested in thinking about a relationship in a positive way with Israel, who is absolutely making moves in order to begin a conflict. And you have surrounding Arab countries who are willing to support whatever Egypt does because of Nasser's influence and the idea of pan-Arabism. Notice that nothing in there has to do with Palestinians, by the way. The Arab states at this point in time are not talking about anything related to the needs of the Palestinian people. Jews in America are deeply concerned about what will happen to Israel in 1967. And when Israel engages in a preemptive strike in 1967, because it is a just war action, you know you're about to be attacked, you need to preemptively engage. American Jews have a revitalization in that period and in the wake of 67 and into 73 of a sense of Zionist identity. You see a wave of Anglos who make Aliyah and who feel like there is real possibility of having a different kind of life in Israel, one that they can't necessarily have in America as a Jew. And it reinvigorates this sense of Jewish nationalism. A sense that for many hadn't been stirred in the way that now it would be after 67. That idea of Klal Yisrael and peoplehood becomes a very important narrative, but what you also have to understand is that there is an element in that narrative that relates to crisis. And this raises a serious question, not just for 67, not just for 73, not just for the Intifada period of 2001, but actually for today, which is around, can you have a narrative, a crisis Zionist narrative, as your primary modus operandi of orienting yourself in relationship as a North American Jew to Israel? I would argue no. But I will tell you that many Jewish communal organizations try very hard to leverage the crisis Zionism for all of your philanthropic dollars, to ensure that you make sure your kids go to Israel, but it's not built actually on thick, substantive identity and understanding of the complexity of Israeli society and Israeli history. And that is, I would say, a point of contention that we, as individuals who care about this, have to think through. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about how this relationship has shifted between North American Jews and Israel. For some of you, you may remember, whether it was because you yourself did it or you remember your grandparents walking through your neighborhood with the pushkis that were blue and white tzedakah boxes from Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, the Jewish National Fund, in order to raise money, Jewish trees for the Jewish land, for the Jewish people. That is a particular historical memory, a particular experience. But by the 1980s, that is not the experience that most American Jews recall. It is also not an experience to rely on the traumas of the Holocaust, where the mantra of never again was the mantra that you need a Jewish state, you need a Jewish homeland, so never again can the Jews be isolated in the world. That too didn't have enough resonance and staying power. And what you begin to see in the 1980s in the North American Jewish life is that there remains a desire to connect to this place, but just like what you have in Israel, after the first Lebanon War in 1982, which was deemed to be the first war of choice, Milchemet Breira, in comparison to all the previous wars, which had been wars of no choice, Milchemet Ein Breirot. You didn't have a choice. Israel had to fight. If it didn't fight, it didn't live. But the first Lebanon War was the first time you see within Israeli society high-ranking Israeli officials write letters in order to say, we shouldn't be going into Lebanon. It's when you see Shalom Akshav, peace now, emerge in the wake of the first Lebanon War. So you start to see some different voices emerge and they're no longer just monolithic in terms of how Israel engages either politically or militarily. And when you start to see that in Israel, it starts to also have an impact and a ripple effect here in the North American Jewish community, where now you have North American Jews who say, I still care about this place, but I'm not giving to a state institution. And not only do I not want to give to a state institution, I actually want to give to the non-governmental organizations that are filling the gaps where the state has failed. So sometimes that relates to religion and society issues. Sometimes it relates to issues related to Mizrahi. Sometimes it relates to issues in terms of new communities that are coming into Israel, whether it's from the former Soviet Union, whether it's from Ethiopia. And you also have a very important issue that not enough discussion is held in the North American experience around, which is about Palestinians. And so there's a movement by lots of North American Jews to say, we need to actually focus on some of these other areas that has actually, most of them, been neglected by our larger communal organizations, and yet they are of primary importance in terms of what's actually happening within the state. Now, we talked a little bit last night, and so we don't have to go into as much detail right now. We can come back to it. But even within the internal North American Jewish educational conversation, you start to see this real tension between particularism and universalism more and more strained. And the universalism is elevated at the expense of the particularism. You start to see that there is a real tenuous issue around what does Klal Yisrael actually mean? What is this peoplehood piece actually about? We are in a new reality. I'm not making a judgment about it. I'm making a statement where 50% of the American Jewish community is now in interfaith marriages. It's actually over 50%. Not judging the reality, but that means we have an issue in which if you don't educate the partner from that interfaith, practice about peoplehood, not just about Judaism as a religion, but about shared ancestry, about Zionism, then we as a population here in North America will see a real disintegration of understanding why Israel matters to the next generation of Jews. And that peoplehood education is a real education that I do not see in existence at this moment in Jewish communal life. I mentioned in the earlier session that there are some intellectual ideas that deeply matter in terms of having tools in your toolkit to be able to learn how to engage and think critically, use these different ideas to help inform the ways in which individuals think. But part of the challenge is that some of these intellectual ideas, as I mentioned, have become a prism through which all matters are then refracted, usually quite unfairly. And some of these ideas have incredible resonance that go way beyond the ivory towers, way beyond scholarship, and influence politics, media, whether it's traditional or social, and also social justice movements. And so it's very important for all of you to understand what some of these intellectual ideas are. Some of these ideas you have heard. Marxism, for example. Here in this conversation, it is not about economics, but it is about power. Those who are strong ought to be weakened. Those who are weak ought to be strengthened. That's the framework. The idea, for example, of post-colonialism from the 1960s. The idea of Orientalism, written by Edward Said, a professor of comparative literature, in the 1978 period. Now, Orientalism, just to give you an understanding, isn't only about Jews in Israel, for sure. Let me explain Orientalism in the 21st century. When we see someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, how many of you know Ayaan Hirsi Ali? Not enough people. After Shabbat, order Ayaan Hirsi Ali's books from whichever independent bookstore you would like. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a Somalian-born woman who had to flee Somalia after forced genital mutilation, who then goes to the Netherlands and makes a film with Theo van Gogh called Submission, which talks about radical Islamism. Theo van Gogh is murdered and his body is left in the streets of the Netherlands with a note attached that says, "Coming for you next, Ayaan." She then is elected, after she goes to university, into the parliament in order to be able to contribute meaningfully to democracy. You tell me where the Western world was to protect Ayaan Hirsi Ali and denounce radical Islamism and female genital mutilation. Nowhere. You want to know why? Orientalism. What do I mean by that? Orientalism says the following: you, Westerner, you have no right to critique or criticize what's happening in the East. Female genital mutilation, that's part of their culture. You should let it happen. And if you actually say something, you're racist. That's Orientalism. That's a problem. The world was silent and remains silent. When we see slavery happening right now in our world, we usually don't say anything because it's happening in African countries, done by dark-skinned people. Darfur, Niger. That's Orientalism. We should never be okay with slavery, period. So these ideas matter. Postmodernism. In theory, it's created in the 1980s as a tool to study literature, comparative literature. But ultimately, postmodernism says the following: facts don't matter, narratives matter more. I'm telling you, as a historian, facts deeply matter. But it matters when these ideas then are assumed that all narratives are equal, because you create a sense of moral relativism. So these intellectual ideas influence every single one of you, whether you read Orientalism or not. When individuals say what happens on campus stays on campus, I always laugh because it sounds like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It doesn't. And for a long time, when some of us were raising our hands and saying what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus, the response we heard from many Jewish communal leaders was, listen, it's a handful of professors, ideas that no one else is listening to, they're radical, and the kids will mature and grow up and they leave and it won't have an influence. Whereas we know that these ideas do not stay on campus and they influence every realm of mainstream life. And these ideas have influenced all of you. They have influenced your children. They will influence your grandchildren. And it will impact the understanding between the North American Jewish community and its relationship with Israel. I'm going to have 5 minutes and then open it up. The last piece of this relates specifically to language. In our world, we have allowed language to be co-opted and manipulated with no consequences. Terms like racism, apartheid, and genocide are thrown around. Any definition can be attributed to it, even though they have legal definitions and legal meanings. And nobody stops to actually say, that's not what it is. And I would argue that if we do not reclaim language, whether it's the human rights discourse, whether it's about Zionism, whatever the language may be, we will ultimately lose. As individuals and as a people and as a community who cares about language deeply, we need to find a way to actually think about how you reclaim that discourse in a variety of ways, whether it's in the academy, whether it's legally, whether it's in human rights organizations like the United Nations. But we cannot just accept the improper definitions that have now been leveraged in order to be hurled against Jews as the worst human rights violators in the 21st century. And that is what is happening. The last thing I will say relates specifically to the conversation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the context of the American Jewish conversation. In the context of the American Jewish community particularly, there is a position that exists that says anti-Zionism is within the bounds of acceptable discourse and it does not cross into Jew hatred. Now, historically, we know that anti-Zionism has been a position that exists within the Jewish community. Go back to Europe again. When Jews are in Europe, you have a variety of responses to those pressures of assimilation and anti-Semitism. You have some, like the Bundes, the autonomists, who say, we need to create diaspora communities that have autonomy so that we can teach our children the way we want to teach them, but we don't actually have power and influence, but we stay within a diaspora community and live in the host society. You also have those who are hardcore anti-Zionists. You also have Zionists, which is a very small percentage of the Jewish population in Europe at the time, who actually say we need to fight to create a Jewish nation state and imagine it in different ways. Some want socialism, some want religion, some want later capitalism and more politics. It just depends. We're Jews. We don't always agree in those early stages. You also have, in the discussion around anti-Zionism, you have Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, who hold anti-Zionist positions because they need the Messiah to come, and you're trying to usher in a political state, a third sovereignty without a Messiah. I say this because anti-Zionism does exist historically within the Jewish historical experience. Now, post-1948, when the state is established, anti-Zionism didn't disappear. And now, let's make it more complicated. You have a state of Israel. You have a Haredi population who refuse to serve, who won't pay taxes. The state provides, yet they hold an anti-Zionist position. You also have Arabs who are citizens of the state who absolutely want to be citizens of the state who do not identify as Zionists. It's complicated. And then in the diaspora, American Jewish experience, you also have anti-Zionists. And they hold anti-Zionist positions for a variety of reasons. Some of them because they say there shouldn't be a Jewish state. Some of them because they say ultimately they think that Zionism has become the religion of the Jews instead of Judaism. And they are conflicted. I can have this conversation for hours, even though you look like it's time for a schluff, right? Because it is interesting and it is complex, it is theoretical, and it is very realistic. What I also can tell you is that what is playing out right now in our society, when we see that Israelis and Israel and those who identify with the Jewish state being demonized, for me, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Full stop. Not every Jew will agree with that. But I think you have to understand the intent behind the action. And if you have Jewish students or young Jews who say, ultimately, that every nation state can exist but one, they too need to understand they are now swimming in the waters of Jew hatred. That has to be taught to them. Doesn't mean that they will then retract their position, but don't sugarcoat that they have bedmates who seek the demise of the largest Jewish population. That's genocide. And that is a conversation, as hard and uncomfortable as it may be, that we as parents, grandparents, and community members have to have with Jews. because otherwise you will see organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, try to be representative of the mainstream Jewish position, and they are anything but. And this will be a challenge, particularly for the American Jewish community. I want to stop there and have questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fish. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions, depending on how long they are. Anyone have a question? Is anyone who hasn't potentially asked a question yet this weekend? Woman in green. Terry, yeah. I'm going to hand the mic to you so that you can speak. Hold it.
So I will admit part of what I'm in this question is from just reading general newspaper and magazine stuff. But this definition of genocide and the statement, I believe that I read that initially it was a legal term and now has gone beyond. So I wonder if you could help define the genocide and legalities at the international level versus the other, or sociologic.
Yeah. Sorry. So I'll just briefly say, with not going into all the detail because it is a long explanation. One, the term comes from Raphael Lemkin, and the term comes, he's a Jewish lawyer, after what happens during the Holocaust. And it is specific to understanding what the Nazis attempted to do to Jews during the Holocaust. The definition of a genocide legally is about the ultimate destruction of the ethno-community, whatever that ethno-community is, with the attempt to annihilate it. So that's what the definition is about. How it's being used today is that when there are real atrocities, and they are human tragedies, for sure, but it doesn't mean it's a genocide in what you see playing out in Gaza. It just isn't. And it doesn't mean the loss of innocent life isn't very real. And the fact that you have international organizations who do not give agency to the terrorist organizations who hide behind innocent civilians tells you that there is something else at play. And so that's part of this equation that has to be discussed. And very often, we forget to talk about the role of Hamas. And that has to stop. There's a question back there, too. Yep, so it's okay, I'm gonna repeat it, don't you worry. I'm here to help. So the question was, if you look at the last slide that I had, there's a bullet that says Jewish leadership needs to articulate a strategic approach and not only social welfare services. And the question is, what do I mean by that? So I'm gonna say something that's usually uncomfortable for people to hear, and usually people get upset. So I'm naming that so that if you're one of those people, put your feelings aside for a minute. The way in which the Jewish communal organizations in America in particular were organized were primarily for social welfare services. Very important. Make sure that Holocaust survivors have a roof over their head. Make sure that elderly Jews can get the medical care and the food that they need. Make sure that there are Jewish educational programs that are set up. That's what I mean by social welfare. Very valuable. Also, Jewish boy meet Jewish girl and have Jewish babies. Right? Those are social welfare services. When you are being attacked, those services don't help you. Doesn't mean they're not necessary. You still need to do them. But what do you do when you're actually confronted with Jew hatred, for example? Those services don't have an answer for it. So you need Jewish leadership, one, to be able to articulate the time we are currently in. We are in a time in which we have a position in which radical Islamists, white supremacists, right, hard left ideologues hate us, and we have to be able to say it. And we have to be able to say that we need a plan for that. And the plan can't be go have Shabbat dinner at Chabad. That's important, but that's not a plan. And so you need Jewish leaders and Jewish communal organizations to actually say, hold on, we need organizational structure to actually sit there and map out what are the lanes in which Jews are facing serious challenges. K through 12, higher education, interfaith relations, community relations at the civic level and at the political level. That means local municipalities, state, federal system. Media, traditional and social media. The narrative war, education writ large. Once you actually map it out, which very few communities have done, then you need to develop a strategic offense. As someone who has played sports my entire life, you can't only win with defense. Doesn't work. There aren't enough Jewish communal organizations who have A, mapped it out, and B, developed a strategic offense. We often wait till something happens, and then we cry, woe, because we were ill-prepared. We didn't articulate that we're in a new time. Our leaders failed us on that front, and they should be doing tshuva, because they didn't tell us what was coming when they should have. And now we need them to say, strategically, here's what we do offensively. None of these Jewish communal leaders are elected officials. They were appointed. I appreciate that they want these positions, but then they need to be responsible for the needs that we have as communities. And we need to be saying to our leaders, what is your plan? What is your plan for education? What is your plan for K through 12? What is your plan to get more of us on the school board? What is your plan for community relations? And if they don't have a plan, force them to create one. That's what I mean.
We're going to take one last question. Brother Tofsky.
Too many questions I have. We have ADL, we have AJC, we have the Community Relations Committee. When, not too long ago, in my lifetime, the Jews were considered the most liked people in America. It wasn't that long ago. I'm not that old. I haven't heard the word Netanyahu today or last night.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear it the other night when Federation sponsored a program. The Netanyahu government is not exactly loved by everybody. He has refused to talk about the day after, has absolutely rejected a Palestinian state. Do you think this has anything to do with the anti-Jewish feeling?
Yeah, it is a good question. Part of why I haven't talked about Netanyahu is because I don't need to. The Jew hatred persists whether Netanyahu is in government or not. If Yair Lapid is, if Yair Lapid is elected tomorrow, I will not see a decrease in Jew hatred in America. I just won't. Now I want to say something important. I am not interested in creating a distinction between the good Jews and the bad Jews. This is very important to me. If you're the good Jew, you're supposed to be the Jew who regularly denounces the Israeli government. If you're the bad Jew, you're the Jew who supports Netanyahu. We can do it also on American politics. I can map it. The good Jew supports a Democratic Party. The bad Jew supports the Republicans. I'm not interested in that game because it creates divisiveness amongst the Jewish community, and I do not want divisiveness. This is a moment in time in which we need biyachad, togetherness. And if we don't have it now, in the wake of October 7th, I do not expect us to ever have it. Now, I'll say a third thing. Netanyahu is a major issue for Israelis. Of course, Netanyahu is going to have to be a major issue for American Jews. And Netanyahu is a major issue for Americans. Absolutely. And it's not just Netanyahu. It's that Netanyahu allowed thugs and criminals into his existing coalition, which to me is despicable and to most Israelis. It is bleeding extremism and nationalism that ultimately creates religious fanaticism and also terrorism. I do not want the Jewish state to be a state that is feeling proud of those who actually seek to harm innocent individuals, whether they're Palestinian, whether they are secular Israelis. That is a problem for us. That is a problem for Israel. That is a problem for who is elected and who is chosen. It is a problem for a broken political system that doesn't have new and refreshing political leaders, similar to this country. That is a serious, serious problem. And yet, none of that can determine how I feel about fighting Jew hatred. None of it. Because whether it's Lapid, whether it's Netanyahu, I guarantee you that the campus doesn't change. I've been seeing it for too long. And I respect that opinion. I respect it. That's what makes us appreciate difference. But I know that if I hold my breath for a government that is more centrist, to assume that it will be better for Jews in this country, I'm ultimately sticking my head in the sand. And I can't do it. So therefore, irrespective of Netanyahu, which I do hope there's a new government sooner rather than later, that doesn't allow extremists and religious nationalists and bigots in it, I also will continue my hardest to create biyachad in this country for American Jews, because I cannot predicate our community identity on the elected official of Israel.
I want to thank Rachel so much for your lessons and your passion and all you're doing for America and for the Jewish community and for Israel. Thank you for coming home to Cleveland.
Thank you.